helps us separate fact from fiction when it comes to the stem cell debate.
Stem cells are unspecialized cell types that have a remarkable capacity to give rise to large numbers of other specialized cell types. Embryonic stem cells are one type of stem cell that people are very excited about because these are cells that come from the very earliest stages of embryonic development, from only microscopically small clumps of cells. These cells have the capacity to make every cell type in the body in unlimited quantities. And so when you're really trying to cure a major public health problem like juvenile diabetes or Parkinson's disease, the capacity of embryonic stem cells to make any cell type in unlimited quantities is an extraordinarily powerful advantage. The things that people should know to really make up their own mind about how they feel about embryonic stem cell research are that there are thousands of embryos that are routinely discarded by fertility clinics in the state and throughout the country. Those embryos, for a variety of reasons, could never be used for fertility treatment, but they could be used to derive new embryonic stem cell lines that represent the best hope for thousands of patients in our state and in the country. The state and federal restrictions that exist on embryonic stem cell research don't save a single embryo from destruction. These restrictions only delay medical research because the embryos that would be used for this research are already being thrown away. There are many restrictions that scientists observe in this area, and I think nobody feels more strongly than the scientists themselves that it's really necessary that this work go ahead according to the highest ethical standards. The bottom line is that if we really are serious about fighting disease, we should be using every weapon in our arsenal. We shouldn't be fighting disease with one arm tied behind our back. We should be pursuing all types of promising research so that we get to the cure sooner rather than later.
Is that a compelling argument? We're throwing them away anyway. We're discarding them. Now, the sanctity of life argument is, well, you can't use a life or take a life to save a life. Because right now, when we take stem cells out of an embryo, we destroy the embryo. The embryo loses capacity to live. The counter argument to that is, of course we do. When you send people off to war, right now 1.4% of American people defend your right to not have to go to war. Better to sacrifice a few lives so the nation doesn't perish. We do that every time we go to war. So we use that rationale, but it does come into conflict with the traditional sexual morality that life begins at conception. You have no right to end a life to try and save other lives. So we have two ends of the spectrum here. But right now we routinely destroy embryos rather than do any research with them, which is destroying a life. When you throw a life in the garbage, when you dispose of it, you're destroying that life. It has no potential at all. One of his arguments is, well, it does have potential, but that hinges on being able to, what? Open the blueprint of life and get it to do what we want it to do. So that raises another moral issue he's not dealing with. But just from a biological and scientific point of view, we're destroying them anyway, so why not destroy them and get some benefit out of them? Take the stem cells out of them and see if we can cure diseases. So both ends of those arguments can be considered a strong argument. It depends on whether you want to go the next step. Does everybody follow that or no? Okay. Let me show you the second one. This is a decent argument again for it.
What's the right thing to do? What's the appropriate way about going about this? Does this question have an answer? Over the last several years, stem cell research has been associated with a lot of enthusiasm, but it's also been associated with a lot of ethical issues. Recently, we've seen a lot of attention and a lot of scientific excitement over IPS, or induced pluripotent stem cell research. This is very exciting science.
You could take a skin cell, like a cheek swab, or medical waste from a procedure, and take those cells, give them a little sort of fountain of youth cocktail, and turn them into something that is like embryonic stem cells, that can turn into, that is pluripotent, that can turn into any cell in the human body. Science, by its nature, moves very quickly and unpredictably, and generally out of the public spotlight. So it's generally not until after the initial science has already been produced and published, that policymakers or the general public hear about it. When President Obama issued his executive order rescinding the Bush administration order, he directed the National Institutes of Health to develop guidelines for federal funding of embryonic stem cell research. And it's dramatically increased the amount of stem cell research that's actually funded in the US. So the National Academy's guidelines, which were the first set of guidelines out there at all in the United States for governing stem cell research, arose out of the interests of scientists who understood very clearly that this was a socially controversial area of science, and in the absence of any federal regulation, went to the national academies and said, please develop guidance, develop a system under which we can operate so that we are accountable and so that we prevent bad outcomes. Scientists go into science to do science, not to do law. So we developed a project looking at international collaboration in stem cell research in the context of this highly varied landscape of policies governing stem cell research. And this turned out to be the beginning of what we now call the Hingston Group, which is an international consortium of scientists, ethicists, policymakers, lawyers, philosophers who are interested in, as I said before, fostering ethically and scientifically defensible research.
Some of the most heated ethical controversies related to embryonic stem cell research have related to the fact that embryos need to be destroyed in order to create embryonic stem cell lines. Professional groups were coming into the picture saying, we know that there are ethical issues involved, we know that there are different laws locally, nationally, and internationally, and they wanted to provide scientists with a way of negotiating among these different laws and ethical norms. Under the National Academy of Sciences, this is known as an escrow, nothing to do with the mortgage crisis, but the Embryonic Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee. For the ISSCR, the International Society of Stem Cell Research, they recommend a SCRO, a Stem Cell Research Oversight Committee, because they took on the larger task of not just looking at the ethical issues with embryonic stem cell research, but those of all sorts of stem cells. At Hopkins, we obviously took notice of these major national and international guidelines, assembled a committee of people from across the university, given that we do a considerable amount of stem cell research, and made a decision to proceed with establishing an escrow here at Johns Hopkins. We constructed a multidisciplinary committee. This includes scientists, includes ethicists, attorneys, and non-institutional members, so that we have relevant expertise in the room to consider the range of issues that are associated with stem cell research. If a scientist at Johns Hopkins wants to do research involving human embryonic stem cells, either research directed at deriving new human embryonic stem cell lines, or doing laboratory work involving existing human embryonic stem cell lines, then she or he has to come to the escrow for approval for that research.
What bioethicists and folks like myself who are scientists who are now doing work in ethics and policy try to do is to get ahead of that curve a bit. So to try to forecast, by speaking with scientists and working with scientists, try to identify what are those issues that are coming down the pike scientifically that are going to be of interest and potentially of concern to the general public and to policymakers, and to try to be proactive about developing guidance for how policymakers and the public might regard or regulate or oversee emerging technologies.
Being in the field of bioethics is fantastic. We get to take the hardest questions, the things that people talk about at the dinner table or at a cocktail party, and really study them. Really try to figure out what's the right thing to do. What's the appropriate way about going about this? Does this question have an answer?
So does that argument carry the day? Putting scientists in charge of the ethicists of scientific research? Is that like putting the wolf in charge of the hen house and making the rules up? Because if the wolf eats all the eggs, there's no more food next day. Or does it make sense to put the people involved in research in charge of the research when it comes not just to the biological issues, but to the ethical issues that are going to accompany them?
I think they've set up these consortiums to not only include, like, yes, they're going to look out for their own scientific interests, but then they have essentially people to check, like, okay, you're not just wanting to create a super soldier. So they have, other people in place that will keep the science in check. Hopefully.
Thank you for adding that, hopefully.
Oh no, I feel like you wouldn't be able to keep them in check, because if they do come up with something, they can use it also as like a weapon and like convince other people or manipulate other people to going along with what they say.
You guys ever see a movie called The Spy Was a Catcher?
No, but I was going to say about was it Werner von Braun that didn't think that the atomic bomb research he was doing was actually going to be used for a weapon?
Well, that's part of it. We make certain assumptions that people have the best interest of everybody involved. But what that best interest is questionable. And you always have to go back, because the only example we have in the modern time of people trying to do this was the Nazi regime. Their best interest was to create a superior race. They thought that would be beneficial to all humanity. At the expulsion of everybody else, it wouldn't matter.
A leader in Guam that was attempting to do genetic modification.
And they're doing it all over right now, people. So to put scientists in charge of their own work under the assumption that because they say they'll be moral, and I'm not saying they won't, because they say they'll be moral, never accounts for the one-off. And once you get the one-off, you have no control over what that's going to produce. Go ahead.
Could I look at the other side of that coin and say that the regulation from the higher-ups that are seeing what is happening with this research, Hitler had an immense amount of standing with the public and power with the public. If it weren't for that, I don't think that any kind of breakthroughs in technology would have gained the footwork to be able to take off like it did.
Okay, so that's a valid example. What if private funding and you don't need the support of the public? We have billionaires and we have two companies worth $1 trillion, and there's no regulation on this at all. So what if someone could privately do it and one day just show up and say, hey, look what we can do, and it's attractive. We don't know what the underlying motives are, we just know that the bait looks good. You realize when you catch a fish, the fish does not expect to get eaten. The bait looks good. I mean, Hitler, I don't want to go into the politics too much, I have a couple more things and I'll let you go. Hitler funded his war machine by promising everybody a Volkswagen. You know what German enough Volkswagen? A people's car, 800 Deutschmark. You put it up front, and just like the Tesla, you put it up front and you'll get it sooner or later. He took all that money and he built a war machine. And look what he did with it. But he had the people's trust and confidence. So I'm just saying you can get that in the public. If it works positively, you get a positive result. But look what happened there. But in the private sector, no one's got any idea what's going on. And once you have the breakthrough that's so attractive to everybody, but you don't know what the underlying motives are, you know, is that the bait that gets the fish into the boat or into the frying pan? We don't know. That's all I'm saying. There's just too many variables. Those are good arguments. We can make supportive arguments on both sides of this. You know, my concern, and I shared with you on Monday, I have two concerns. One is with embryonic stem cell research. One is with capital punishment.